Hello, my friend. Middle-earth, filled with legends and ancient tales, is opening its gates once again. Tonight, by the crackling fireplace, I will share another incredible story. Join us, for the magic is about to come alive. The night in Mirkwood was never truly silent. Even in its deepest hours, when the moon was veiled by tangled branches and the stars peered only in slivers through the thick canopy, the forest whispered. Leaves rustled, though no wind stirred them. Owls called out their solemn songs. Somewhere, beyond sight, a stream trickled over smooth stones, murmuring to itself in an ancient tongue. And in a small clearing nestled amid roots and brambles, a crooked house stood. It was a house that belonged to no man or elf. It was built not by dwarven hands nor by the skill of the Númenóreans, but by the gentle patience of nature itself. Its walls were entwined with vines, its thatched roof laced with moss. The very trees bent protectively over it, as if they had grown to shield its master from the world beyond. This was Rosgobel, and within its warm embrace lived Radagast the Brown, the tender of beasts, the friend of birds, the watcher of woods. The wizard sat hunched over a wooden table, candlelight flickering across his wild, unkempt beard. His robe, once a deep earthen brown, was smudged with moss and streaked with dirt, as though he had been rolling through the underbrush. Small twigs and leaves clung to his tangled hair, and around his shoulders perched a tiny sparrow, dozing soundly. Before him lay an open scroll, its edges curling with age. He traced his fingers over the faded runes, whispering the words beneath his breath. It was an old record, older than the kingdoms of men, older even than many of the trees of Mirkwood. It spoke of a shadow, a darkness that once stirred beneath the roots of the world and had long since been forgotten. Radagast frowned. Forgotten, yes, but not gone. A rustling at the window made him glance up. A great owl, its feathers dusted with silver, peered inside with wide, intelligent eyes. The wizard rose from his seat, unlatching the window with hands as gentle as a breeze. The owl fluttered in, landing on a wooden perch beside a stack of dried herbs. "Well now," Radagast murmured, brushing a stray feather from his sleeve. "You're earlier than usual, old friend." The owl blinked slowly, then let out a soft hoot. Radagast's expression darkened. He nodded solemnly. "The eagles have seen it too, then." The owl fluffed its wings, shifting uneasily. Radagast turned, pacing the small room. His fingers absently trailed over the various relics and charms scattered about. A silver acorn from the gardens of Lorien, a polished stone gifted to him by a river spirit, a small wooden carving of a stag, its antlers wide and proud. "Something is stirring," he mused aloud. "Something that does not belong." For many years, Mirkwood had suffered the weight of a darkness it had not fully understood. The shadow of Dol Guldur had stretched long over its borders, twisting the land and filling its hollows with fear. But that darkness had been Sauron's doing, the necromancer's presence, and now he was gone. Wasn't he? Radagast ran his fingers through his wild hair, shaking his head. No, Sauron had fled to Mordor. His dark will no longer festered here. But that did not mean the forest was free. Evil had many faces, and some were older than even the Dark Lord himself. The owl let out another low hoot, and Radagast sighed. "I will go," he promised. "I will see it with my own eyes." With that, he turned to a gnarled staff propped against the wall, its surface rough and worn from years of use. He slung a small satchel over his shoulder, filled it with dried leaves, berries, and a few healing tinctures. Then, after a final glance around his home, he stepped outside into the night. Mirkwood loomed before him, its towering trees like silent sentinels. Their twisted roots groped through the soil, their tangled limbs whispering secrets to the wind. Somewhere in the darkness, an unseen presence stirred. Radagast took a deep breath. Then, without another word, he vanished into the forest. For a time, all was quiet save for the occasional chirp of a cricket or the rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. The wizard moved carefully, his bare feet padding softly over moss and fallen leaves. He did not disturb the spiders, though they lurked in the deeper shadows, watching with their many gleaming eyes. Nor did he startle the bats, which flitted silently overhead, their wings no louder than whispers. But the deeper he walked, the stranger the air became. The trees grew still, their branches no longer swaying, even though Radagast could feel the presence of a wind against his face. The animals, those that had filled the night with their usual sounds, had gone silent. A shiver ran down his spine. The shadow was real, and it was waiting. Somewhere ahead, hidden beneath the oldest roots of Mirkwood, something ancient had awakened. Radagast tightened his grip on his staff. He was no warrior. He wielded no sword, no mighty spells of fire and wrath. But he was a guardian of the wild, a protector of things most overlooked. And if this shadow sought to harm his forest, it would find that even the smallest creatures of Middle-earth had teeth. He stepped forward, deeper into the dark, and the forest swallowed him whole. The night lay heavy upon Mirkwood, a dense shroud of shadow where the trees leaned close, their gnarled arms entwining like the fingers of old, whispering sages. The wind had long since ceased its murmuring. Now only silence stretched between the roots, deep and ancient, as if the very forest had paused to listen. Radagast felt the weight of it upon his shoulders, like the hush before a storm, the air thick with something unspoken. He tread carefully, his bare feet sinking into the damp earth, rich with the scent of moss and decay. His heart was steady, but in the quiet places of his mind something stirred. A warning, a whisper, a feeling as old as the stars. For all the wisdom he had gathered in his years, he had learned that the world often spoke in subtleties, and that darkness was not always heralded by fire and fanfare, but sometimes by silence too deep, by the absence of song where song should be, by the tremor of the smallest creatures sensing something beyond their comprehension. He paused. A rabbit lay still upon the ground, its small body rigid, though no wound marked it. Its wide, glassy eyes stared at the unseen sky beyond the branches, unblinking. The forest had claimed it suddenly, without struggle, without cause. Radagast knelt beside it. brushing his fingers gently over the fur, his heart aching for the small life that had ended so strangely. He whispered to it, not words, but something softer, a murmur that was neither spell nor speech, but an old comfort, one only the woods would understand. "What have you seen, little one?" he murmured, voice hushed as the fog curling between the roots. A shiver ran through the trees, the leaves trembling without a breeze. Something was watching, a flicker of movement in the branches above, a shadow without form. Radagast did not startle. Fear was a thing for those who had no place in the wild, and he had walked its tangled paths long enough to know that darkness was not always an enemy. But still, a caution settled deep in his bones. The forest pressed in around him, its silence growing heavier. Even the wind seemed hesitant now, curling around his robes like the breath of some unseen presence, watching, waiting, measuring. Then, from the blackened stretch of tangled boughs, a voice, not one of the living, but something older, something that had never needed breath to speak. He listens. It was neither sound nor thought, but something in between, something that curled inside the bones, that coiled in the marrow and whispered without ever touching the air. Radagast straightened, his grip tightening upon his staff. "Yes," he answered, his voice barely more than a breath. "And he hears." A hush, then laughter, soft and curling, as if the very roots of the trees had exhaled. It was not cruel nor warm, but something stranger, something ancient. "You are old, brown wizard, and yet you tread as though you do not know us." Radagast's fingers brushed the bark of a tree beside him, tracing its lines, its ridges, feeling the heartbeat within it, the slow, steady pulse of something that had seen the world long before even the Astari had walked it. "I know many things," he said carefully, "but knowledge is like the wind. It shifts, it changes. And what I knew yesterday may no longer be true today." Another ripple of laughter, winding between the trunks like mist. "And you are wise enough to learn." Radagast did not answer immediately. He let the silence settle, let the moment breathe. Then he spoke, his voice lower, softer. "Tell me," he said, "what it is I do not know." The laughter ceased. The shadows did not move, nor did they retreat, but the weight of them pressed against him, close, tangible, like fingers resting against his mind. "The forest remembers," the voice murmured. Radagast's breath caught. Yes, that was it, wasn't it? The feeling that had gnawed at the edges of his mind, the weight in the air, the silence where song should be. It was memory, not fear, not evil, memory. The trees did not speak in words, but in the language of years, in the slow shifting of roots, in the turning of leaves, in the quiet remembrance of all that had passed before. And what had passed here, long before Radagast had ever set foot in these woods, was awakening. "But do you remember?" he asked. The silence stretched. Then, at last, the whisper came again, curling like ivy through the shadows. "A name." A pause. A name that should not have been spoken. Radagast's pulse quickened. The weight of history settled over him, heavy, undeniable. He had spent his years tending to the small things, the gentle things, the birds, the beasts, the green things that grew unseen by the great powers of the world. He had left the battles to Gandalf, to Saruman, to those who stood in the light and the fire. But this was different. This was not war. This was something older, something forgotten, something spoken into the earth itself. And something had stirred it awake. The trees creaked, their groaning limbs shifting as if sighing beneath a great weight. The air shivered with something unseen, something neither light nor darkness, but deep, old, waiting. Radagast exhaled. "I will listen," he said, and the forest began to speak. The forest was awake now, not in the way of beasts rustling in the underbrush or the distant hooting of an owl, but in something deeper, something more ancient. The air itself trembled with remembrance, with the slow and ponderous weight of memory that had lain dormant beneath the roots of Mirkwood for an age. Radagast stood motionless, listening, as the trees around him groaned softly, their limbs swaying without wind, whispering to one another in voices that only the earth itself could understand. There was a heaviness here, a presence not merely unseen, but felt, woven into the very air like mist before dawn, like the hush before a thunderstorm that has yet to break. He tightened his grip on his staff, his fingers curling over the worn wood, feeling the familiar grooves where his hands had rested for years, his constant companion in his wanderings. There was something different about the night now. He could feel it pressing against his skin, not as an enemy, not yet, but as something vast and unknowable, something that was neither kind nor cruel, only old, older than the ruins of kingdoms, older than the rivers that had cut through stone for 1,000 years, older than even the stars that flickered faintly through the dense canopy above. A voice, woven of shadow and silence, whispered once more, a name. Radagast let the words settle within him, like stones dropped into a still pool, sending ripples through the quiet places of his mind. A name. Names had power. A name spoken into the wind could shape the world if the world chose to listen. A name whispered in the dark could wake things that had long since been put to rest. A name was not merely a word, not merely sound. It was history, intent, identity. And for something as old as the forest to remember a name, to fear it enough to stir after so many years of silence. This was no small thing. "I have known many names," Radagast said at last, his voice gentle, slow, the way one speaks to a wounded animal, uncertain whether it will bolt or bare its fangs. "I have seen the names of kings written upon stones now crumbled to dust, their legacies lost to time. I have heard the names of rivers, of valleys, of places that men have walked for generations but never truly known. I have known names that were whispered in fear, names that were sung in joy. Tell me, what name does the forest remember?" Silence. The air grew heavier still, thick with something unseen. something that wound itself through the branches and coiled around the roots, something ancient that had waited, patient, unmoving. Then, softly, so softly that it might have been the creaking of a tree limb, the sigh of the earth itself, the name came. Radagast inhaled sharply, though he did not yet understand why. The name was unfamiliar, yet it carried with it a weight that settled deep in his bones, in the quiet spaces between his thoughts. It was not a name of men, nor of elves, nor even of the creatures that had walked the earth in the elder days. It was something else, something forgotten, and the forest feared it. He could feel it now more than before. The unease woven into the trees, the hush that had fallen upon the creatures of the wood, the silence where there should have been life. The leaves themselves seemed to recoil from the word, though no wind stirred them, as if even the trees wished to unremember what had been spoken. Radagast exhaled, slow and careful, forcing his voice to remain steady. Mergal, he repeated, letting the name linger on his tongue, tasting the weight of it. What was it? Who was it? The shadows did not answer at once. Instead, the ground beneath him trembled, not violently, not as in the earthquakes that had split mountains or swallowed cities, but as a sigh, as something long buried shifting ever so slightly, a memory exhaling beneath the soil. Before the darkness of Dol Guldur, the voice murmured, softer now. Before even the necromancer came, before his poison seeped into the roots of this place, the shadow had another name. It was not one of his, not one of Morgoth's. It was something else. It was the forest's own. Radagast frowned, his thoughts turning over like stones beneath a river's current. The darkness of Dol Guldur, the corruption that had taken root in Mirkwood, had been Sauron's doing, yes. But this was something different. It was not tied to the great wars of men and elves, not to the rings of power, not to the great evils that had risen and fallen like tides upon the shores of history. This was something older, something of the forest itself. Mergal, he whispered again, testing the weight of the name, feeling how the very air seemed to ripple around it, as if the world was listening, remembering, stirring. Tell me its story. The forest hesitated. Radagast closed his eyes, pressing his palm to the rough bark of a nearby tree, feeling its slow heartbeat, the rhythm of years stretching back beyond memory. You have carried this knowledge for so long, he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. You have held it within you, buried it beneath roots and stone, letting time smother it so that it would not wake again. But time does not erase. It only hides. Tell me, old ones. Let me hear what you have hidden. The silence stretched long, the weight of the night settling deep. Then, at last, the voice of the forest spoke. Not in words, not in mere sound, but in memory. And Radagast saw, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, something older. The world around him blurred, and in its place, shadows unfolded. He saw a time when Mirkwood had not been called Mirkwood, when its trees had stood tall and golden beneath an unbroken sky, he saw a presence moving through those ancient woods, a will not of darkness, not of flame, not of Sauron's corruption, but something stranger, something that had been born of the forest itself, something neither entirely good nor entirely evil, but vast, unshaped, raw. It had no form, no face, no body, only a whisper, a knowing, a weight that had pressed upon the trees and bent them toward its will. It had not been a master, it had not ruled, not in the way of men or wizards or dark lords, but it had been. It had belonged to the forest, and then Radagast gasped, stumbling back, the vision vanishing as quickly as it had come, leaving only the cold night and the hush of the trees. "Now you know," the voice whispered, distant, mournful. "Now you see why we tremble." Radagast stood motionless, his breath shallow, his pulse a steady drumbeat against his ribs. Mercule had not been created. Murgle had not come from somewhere else. Merkle had always been here, and now, after long ages of silence, it was waking once more. Radagast exhaled, long and slow, his fingers tightening around his staff. The night pressed close around him, thick with the weight of knowing. He had come to listen, but now he had a choice. He could turn back, or he could step forward, deeper into the shadows, deeper into the unknown, deeper into the memory of the forest itself. And though he did not yet know what he would find, he knew this: he was no longer walking alone. The silence that followed was thick, not the kind of absence that soothes, but the kind that presses down like dampened cloth, suffocating the air between the leaves. The trees stood as still as statues, their limbs neither swaying nor creaking, their very roots clenching into the dark soil as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Radagast stood amidst it, his fingers brushing against the rough bark of an ancient beech tree, feeling the slow, rhythmic pulse of its life beneath his palm, as though it too was wary of the name now spoken aloud. The memory of Murgle had unsettled the wood, not with terror, not with the biting coldness of evil's return, but with something deeper, something resembling grief. It was a sorrow that hummed through the earth like the last lingering note of a song too old for mortal tongues. A sadness that lived not in what had been lost, but in what had been hidden, buried beneath the weight of centuries and the quiet refusal of trees that wished no longer to remember. Radagast swallowed, steadying his breath, feeling the ache of something vast and unknown press against his ribs, curling into his bones like ivy twining up an ancient wall. The forest had given him a name, but not an answer. And names, in Middle-earth, were never just words. They were doors, they were echoes, they were remnants of things too great to be contained in mere syllables. A name once spoken was a thing freed from silence. Slowly he traced his fingers along the ridges of the beech's bark, murmuring words of old comfort, words that the trees might remember, words carried from a time before wizards had walked this land, before even the first dark shadow had crept into its heart. "Tell me, old one," he whispered, voice low, as though speaking too loudly might break the stillness like glass beneath a careless step. "Tell me what you fear." For a long moment there was nothing but the quiet sound of his own breathing, the distant drip of water somewhere beyond the tangled roots, the distant pulse of unseen wings shifting in the darkness. Then, as though the forest itself had sighed, the beach trembled beneath his palm, and the whisper came, not as a voice, not as words, but as something deeper, something carried in the rustling of leaves and the slow, aching groan of wood shifting in the night. It was never meant to be. Radagast's brow furrowed. He let the words settle into him, feeling the weight of them, feeling the space they left between their meaning and the silence that followed. Never meant to be. The words did not carry the weight of doom, nor the finality of destruction. They carried something stranger, something more elusive, as though the very world itself had looked upon Miragul and whispered no, and yet Miragul had remained, his heart beat slow, steady, the pulse of a man who had spent centuries listening to the small voices of the earth, to the murmurs of stream and root and feathered wing. He understood now that this was no mere shadow, no simple ghost of the past returning to haunt the present. This was something else, something that should not have been, yet was. What was it? He asked, his voice no longer hesitant but searching, insistent, the voice of a man who had found the edges of a puzzle too vast for his own understanding and now sought the missing pieces. A spirit? A will? A thing that walked? Or was it only a whisper, a thought that grew too strong, a name given power only because it was remembered? The trees did not answer at once, and in their silence Radagast felt something else, something stirring in the depths of the wood, something pressing close now, not in hostility, not yet, but in awareness. It knew he was here. It knew that he had spoken its name. The thought sent a shiver through him, not of fear, but of something else, something deeper. He had spent his years as a guardian of the wild things, as a friend to the small, unnoticed creatures of the world, as a protector of those who had no voice to speak against the ruin of time. And yet, for all his knowledge, for all his wisdom, there were things older than him, things that had watched the world shift and break and mend 100 times over, things that had been forgotten not because they were unworthy, but because they had chosen to be. And now one of them was waking. Radagast turned his gaze deeper into the forest, his eyes searching the blackness between the trees, where no moonlight touched, where the branches twisted together like the fingers of ancient hands grasping toward the unseen sky. He felt the weight of his own breath, the way the night seemed to hold it, as though the very air had thickened around him, not oppressive, not cruel, but waiting. Then, from somewhere beyond the tangled roots, from the deep hollow where no light reached, there came a sound, not a voice, not a whisper, but something else, something softer, something old. It was the slow creaking of wood, the sigh of leaves stirred by a breathless wind, the distant murmur of something shifting beneath the earth. It was not an approach, it was an acknowledgement. And Radagast understood in that moment that he had crossed a threshold not meant for wizards, not meant for men, nor elves, nor any of the kindreds that had walked the lands since the first age. He had stepped into a place where even the trees had learned to be silent, where even the oldest roots had tried to forget, He took a step forward. The ground beneath him was soft, damp with the weight of centuries, the smell of deep earth rising around him like the breath of something ancient stirring in its sleep. His fingers tightened around his staff, not in fear, not as a weapon, but as a tether, a grounding, a reminder that he was still Radagast the Brown, that he was still himself, even in a place that did not know him. A second step. The sound in the darkness did not retreat, did not advance. It merely was. He exhaled, slow and steady, feeling the weight of the night pressing against his skin. "I have come to listen," he said, his voice no longer a whisper, but something firmer, something carrying the weight of a man who had spent his life tending to the forgotten corners of the world, to the small things, to the wild things, to the voices that no others thought to hear. "And I will not turn away." For a long moment there was nothing. Then at last, from the depths of the unseen hollow, from the place where even the roots dared not wander too deep, came the voice, not as words, not as sound, but as something heavier, something vaster, something woven into the very fabric of the earth itself. "Then listen, brown wizard, and know what should not have been." The forest trembled, and the darkness began to speak. The darkness was not a void, nor was it an emptiness that swallowed the world like the vast, starless abyss that stretched beyond the sky. It was something else, something far older and heavier, something that did not exist in absence, but rather in presence. A presence so immense that it filled the space around it completely, pressing against the trees, against the roots, against the very fabric of the earth itself. Radagast felt it coiling around him like mist, though the air remained still, thick with expectation. It was neither hot nor cold, neither cruel nor kind, neither malicious nor benevolent. It simply was, and in that being it became something altogether different from the darkness of Sauron's making, different even from the lingering sorceries of Dol Guldur. This was not the darkness of fire, of war, of ruin. This was the darkness of memory, the weight of things long buried, of things forgotten not because they were weak, but because they were too strong to be remembered safely. Radagast let out a slow breath, steadying his heart against the immensity of it. The forest around him did not move, yet he felt the trembling in the trees, not in their limbs, not in their roots, but in something deeper, in the very essence of the wood itself. It was not fear, no. It was something older than fear, something the trees themselves had inherited from the bones of the world. A hesitation, a knowing, a remembering. The voice came again, not a sound, not a whisper, but something that formed itself inside his thoughts, a weight pressing against his mind like the hush before a storm. You would listen, brown wizard. You would hear what was not meant to be spoken. Radagast straightened, planting his staff firmly into the earth, not as a challenge, but as a mark of his presence, a declaration that he had stepped into this place willingly, that he was here not as a master, nor as an intruder, but as one who sought understanding. "I would listen," he said, his voice quiet, yet firm, weaving through the stillness like a thread of smoke. and I would understand if understanding is within my grasp. The darkness did not move. The air did not shift, yet Radagast felt it. Something vast, something unseen, considering him. Then his fingers lifted up the thread. As he spoke the words, few seek to understand. Fewer still wish to remember. Radagast exhaled, his fingers tightening around the gnarled wood of his staff. Forgetting is easy, he murmured, more to himself than to the presence that now filled the air around him. It is the nature of all living things to move forward, to step beyond what has been, to seek what is to come rather than linger in what has passed. The river does not stop for the stone that once changed its course, nor do the stars cease their turning for the ruins beneath them. A pause, then a whisper of movement, though no branch stirred, no leaf fell. And yet the stone remains, and yet the ruins still stand. Radagast felt the truth of the words settle deep into him, curling around his thoughts like the slow, deliberate growth of ivy upon an ancient wall. Yes, he admitted, his voice soft, the words carrying the weight of ages. Time does not erase. It only buries, and what is buried does not cease to be. The air thickened, though not with menace. The trees around him did not lean away, nor did they bow, but something in them had shifted, as though they too had remembered something long forgotten, something they had spent centuries trying not to recall. Then listen, brown wizard, and know what should not have been. And then, without warning, the world around Radagast changed. It was not a sudden rupture, not a tearing of fabric, not a rift through which the past bled into the present. It was softer, subtler, like stepping into a deeper part of the forest where the trees have never been touched by the light, where the air grows heavy with the breath of the ancient earth, where the roots dig deeper, not out of necessity, but because they remember what it is to hold something within them. The darkness did not shift, but within it something unfolded, not in sight, not in sound, but in the slow, creeping weight of knowledge. And Radagast saw, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, something older. The trees around him stretched high, not twisted, not blackened with corruption, but immense, their trunks thick as fortresses, their boughs golden in the light of a sun that did not belong to the present. They were trees that had stood before Mirkwood had borne its name, before men had ever set foot in these lands, before even the elves had sung their first songs beneath a starlit sky. The world was different here, not broken, not scarred, not shadowed with the weight of sorrow and war, but full, whole, untouched. The air was heavy with the scent of green things, the wind humming not with words, but with the deep, resonant song of a forest that had never known fear. And yet, Radagast turned, his heart tightening as he felt it. Something within the forest that did not belong. Something that had taken root not as a seed planted in the soil, not as a creature born into the cycle of life and death, but as a thought that had grown too strong, a whisper that had become something more. It was not darkness, not yet. It was something unshaped, something vast and hungry, not for power, not for dominion, but for existence itself. A thing that had been spoken into being not by will, not by design, but by the simple, unavoidable truth that thoughts, once given form, do not vanish. A thing that had been given a name. Myrtle, Radagast exhaled, feeling the weight of the name pressing against him now, not as a force, not as an enemy, but as a presence. Something that had been and still was, something that had lingered in the roots of the world, forgotten, hidden, buried beneath the years. Do you see? The voice murmured, low and vast as the turning of the sky. Radagast nodded, his throat tightening. I see. Then you know. He did not answer at first. He let the knowledge settle into him, let the weight of it press against his bones, let the quiet, aching truth of it unfold. Murgul had never been created. Murgul had never come from beyond the world, nor from the dark forges of Morgoth, nor from the sorceries of Sauron. Myrtle had been spoken into being, a thought too strong to remain merely a whisper, a name given form not by hands, nor by magic, but by the simple act of remembering. And now, after long ages of silence, it was remembering itself. Radagast inhaled, steadying his voice. Then tell me, he said, his voice no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. Tell me what it remembers. The air trembled, the trees sighed, and the darkness began to speak. The night had grown thick and weighty, as if the very air had deepened, sinking into the bones of the forest like the slow creep of winter's chill. The stars were hidden behind the vast interwoven branches above, their tangled arms like the ribs of some ancient beast, sheltering what lay beneath them from the sight of the heavens. The world beyond the trees, the distant lands of men, the mountains that stood sentinel against the sky, the silver rivers that wove their way through Middle-earth, felt like a faraway dream, like something half forgotten, something blurred by time and shadow. Here, in the heart of the deep woods, time did not move as it did in the realms of men and elves. Here, the past was not a memory, nor was the future a thing yet to be written. Here, all things lay coiled within the earth, waiting, sleeping, remembering. Radagast stood motionless, his breath slow and measured, his staff a steady presence in his hand. He had listened to the whispers of rivers, to the songs of the wind through mountain passes, to the murmurs of roots shifting beneath the soil, but never had he listened like this, not to something that was not quite voice, not quite thought, not quite presence, but something between them, something older than all of these, something woven into the very marrow of the earth itself. The voice, if it could be called that, spoke, not in words, but in weight, in knowing, in something vast and unshaped pressing against the edges of his mind. It was neither light nor dark, neither friend nor foe, neither welcoming nor forbidding. It simply was, and that in itself was unsettling, for all things in this world, be they creatures of flesh or spirit, of shadow or fire, had intent, had will, had purpose, but this was something else. You wish to understand, the voice murmured, curling through his thoughts like the slow creeping tendrils of ivy, sinking into the quiet places of his mind where wisdom was not made of words, but of feeling, of instinct, of knowing. But understanding is a door that cannot be closed once opened. Do you wish to step through? Radagast exhaled, steadying himself against the unseen weight of the question, against the sheer depth of it. He was not a warrior like Gandalf, nor was he a scholar like Saruman once had been. He was not one who sought power or dominion, nor one who wielded his knowledge like a blade. He was something else, a listener, a watcher, a keeper of things small and quiet, of things often overlooked by those who stood at the heart of great events. And yet even he hesitated now, for he understood the warning woven within the words. Knowledge was not something that could be untouched once gained. It was not like wind passing through the branches or the flow of water over stone. It took root. It changed those who held it. It shaped them as much as they shaped it. But was that not the very nature of the world? He lifted his gaze, though there was nothing to see but the darkness between the trees, the vast, unknowable depth of the woods that had stood before the first star had ever been kindled in the heavens. He felt the age of this place now, not in years, not in time as men or elves measured it, but in something deeper, something like the slow turning of the earth, something like the weight of mountains that had stood for eons, something that did not fade, but only grew heavier with each passing age. And he knew he could not turn away now. To turn away was to leave this thing, this presence, this whisper, this shadow memory of the forest's past, untouched, to let it remain hidden beneath the roots and soil, to let it continue its slow, unseen stirring. But things that stirred in darkness did not remain hidden forever. He inhaled deeply, feeling the earth beneath his feet, feeling the breath of the trees, feeling the pulse of something vast moving in the unseen places of the world. And then, in a voice quiet yet steady, he spoke. I will listen. The forest did not sigh, nor did the trees move, yet something shifted, not in the air, not in the world around him, but in something deeper. Then listen, and know what should not have been. And suddenly he saw, not with his eyes, not in the way one sees the world around them, but in something deeper, something older than sight, something woven not of images, but of feeling, of weight, of memory, that did not belong to him, but was now his to carry. He saw a time before Mirkwood bore its name, before darkness had crept into its hollows, before the necromancer had ever claimed Dol Guldur, before even the elves had walked beneath its boughs. He saw the world as it had been, untouched, unshaped, still new beneath the first dawn of Arda. The trees were golden, their leaves glistening with light that did not come from sun nor moon, but from the very essence of the earth itself, The air was heavy with the song of growing things, not in words, but in the slow, patient rhythm of roots deepening, of streams carving their paths through stone, of the quiet, eternal breath of the land. And within it, within the untouched, unbroken heart of the forest, something else had stirred, something that was not flesh nor spirit, nor darkness, nor light, something that had been born of the forest itself, yet was not like the trees, not like the rivers, not like the mountains that stood tall and silent in their wisdom. It had not been given form by the hands of the Valar. It had not been shaped by the song of creation. It had simply been. It had willed itself into being, not out of malice, not out of hunger, not out of any desire for dominion or destruction, but simply because the thought of it had been too strong, too vast, too real to remain only a whisper in the wind. And so it had become. It had taken shape, though it had no true form. It had stretched its presence through the roots, through the stones, through the quiet spaces between the leaves, until the very forest itself had shuddered with the knowing of it, and the trees in their wisdom had feared it, for it was something new, something unbidden, something that did not belong to the world as it had been made. It was miracle, and the forest had tried to forget. Radagast gasped, staggering back, the vision tearing itself away like a branch wrenched from a tree. His breath came quick and uneven, his chest heaving as though he had run for miles without rest. The night around him was unchanged, yet he was not, for now he knew, he understood, and he feared, for Mirgal had never been a thing of darkness, nor a servant of evil. It was something else entirely, something that had existed not because it had been created, but because it had been imagined. And now, after long ages of silence, he was stirring again. Radagast gripped his staff, steadying himself, his voice barely more than a whisper as he spoke. But as it seeked, the air trembled, and the darkness whispered back. To exist, the night had grown heavier, thick as river mist before the dawn, pressing against the trees with a hush that seemed to smother even the smallest sounds of life. The wind, which had once whispered gently through the leaves, now curled in upon itself, hesitant, uncertain, as though it too had sensed that something old and vast had begun to stir in the bones of the earth. The silence was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of mere stillness. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting, listening, as if the very roots of the trees had pressed deeper into the soil, desperate to remain unnoticed. The forest itself seemed to recoil from what had been spoken, though the name had already been given shape, and things that had been spoken into being did not unmake themselves so easily. Radagast felt the weight of it settle upon him like the closing of a door behind which no path remained unchanged. He had known many things in his long years, had heard the echoes of old songs that predated the rise and fall of empires, had spoken with the birds of the air and the beasts of the field, had listened to the slow, patient voices of trees that had seen the shaping of Middle-earth itself. But this was something different. To exist, the whisper had said, curling around him like the tendrils of mist that drifted through the tangled roots. To exist. There was something profoundly unsettling in the simplicity of that answer, in the raw, unshaped need of it. This was no hunger for dominion, no thirst for power, no seething malice that sought to corrupt and consume. There was no greed in it, no venom, no cruelty, only longing. And that, in its own way, was far more terrifying. For what in all of Middle-earth was more dangerous than a thing that only wished to be? Radagast exhaled, slow and measured, pressing his fingers into the gnarled wood of his staff, grounding himself against the trembling uncertainty that coiled through his thoughts. He had seen many creatures that wished to exist beyond their appointed time, had felt the lingering unrest of spirits that clung to the world long after their bodies had faded to dust. But Mirgo was not a lingering spirit, nor was it some twisted thing of Morgoth's making, nor was it some fallen shadow of Sauron's dark will. It was something else, something that should never have been. Yet here it was. The whisper had fallen silent, waiting. The air itself seemed to shudder, expectant, like the breath between words, like the moment before thunder cracks through the sky. Radagast closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the rhythm of the forest, feeling the pulse of the earth beneath his feet, sensing the stillness that stretched outward like ripples on the surface of a lake untouched by wind. Then, with a slow breath, he spoke. "But you do exist," he said at last, his voice quieter than the night, yet carrying through the stillness like the call of an unseen bird at dusk. "You are here. I feel you. I hear you. The trees have tried to forget you, but the earth has not let you go. You are real, and that cannot be undone." A long pause followed, deep and unsettling, as though the weight of the unseen had curled around his words, tasting them, testing them, measuring them against the silence. Then, from the darkness, came the reply, soft, uncertain, like the rustling of dry leaves caught in a windless hollow. "To be real is not to be known." Radagast frowned, turning the words over in his mind, tracing the edges of their meaning as one might trace the lines of an old map, following roads that led into lands yet unexplored. He had spent his life tending to things unnoticed, watching over the quiet, the small, the forgotten. He had learned long ago that existence itself was not a simple thing, not for creatures, nor for places, nor even for ideas. To be was not merely to take shape, nor to move through the world as a shadow moves upon the ground. To be was to be seen, to be named, to be remembered, and perhaps that was the heart of it, the terrible, aching truth that pressed against the edges of this presence, this whisper of something unmade yet real, something neither spirit nor shadow, neither darkness nor light. It had not been born into the world, nor had it been summoned by the will of others. It had simply happened. And now, after long ages of silence, after centuries buried beneath the roots of forgetting, it was stirring once more, not out of malice, not out of vengeance, but out of something far more desperate. It did not want power. It did not want conquest. It wanted only what all living things craved, what even the smallest creature of the earth yearned for in the quiet hours of the night. It wanted to be seen. Radagast tightened his grip on his staff, the realization settling deep into his bones, heavy as the weight of a sky filled with storm. "You were not meant to be," he murmured, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "And yet, here you are. The trees tried to forget you, but the earth did not. You waited, hidden beneath the roots, beyond the reach of memory, until something stirred you back into waking. But why now? Why do you wake now?" The air trembled. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, though no wind moved the trees, no footfall disturbed the silence. And then, at last, the whisper came again, curling through the night like the slow, deliberate creeping of ivy over stone. "Because I have been remembered." Radagast's breath caught, his pulse quickening. He understood now, in some deep and terrible way, that his presence here had not been chance, had not been fate, had not been some errant path taken through the tangled woods of Middle-earth. He had come because the forest had called him, but the forest had not merely called. It had been forced to remember. Something had stirred the memory of Mirgil. Something had brought its name from the depths of silence. Something had given shape once more to what the trees had sought to bury. And that meant he was not the first. Someone else had spoken the name before him. Someone else had remembered. His fingers curled tightly around the staff, his mind racing, his thoughts unraveling like threads in an unraveling tapestry. Who had found this name, this thing that should not have been, and pulled it from the depths of forgetting? Who had dared to step into the places where even the trees feared to tread? Who had whispered into the roots? Who had sought what had been hidden? And why? The forest trembled around him, no longer silent, no longer still. He could feel the weight of the trees pressing inward now, not with hostility, but with something more akin to dread, as though they, too, understood what he had only just begun to grasp. Mirgil had been spoken into being once, and now it had been spoken into being again. Radagast swallowed, the night pressing heavy upon him, the whisper of unseen things curling through the air like fog before the coming of dawn. "Who remembered you?" he asked, his voice barely more than a breath. The answer came, quiet as the wind through dead leaves. "Who should not have?" And in that moment Radagast understood. This was only the beginning. The night pressed down upon the world with the weight of ages, thick and unyielding, wrapping the forest in a hush that was neither empty nor still, but laden with the slow and ponderous breath of things unseen. The trees, though vast and ancient, seemed smaller now beneath the canopy of darkness, their great roots gnarled and half-buried beneath the heavy folds of time itself. The earth beneath Radagast's feet pulsed, not with malice, not with any intention of harm, but with the steady thrum of something vast and unseen, something that had always been, and yet had never fully taken shape. The wizard stood motionless, his fingers wrapped tightly around his staff, his breath slow and deliberate, each exhale unfurling like mist in the heavy air. He had known silence before, the silence of deep caves where no light had ever entered, the silence of old ruins where forgotten stones held the echoes of words spoken centuries past. But this silence was different. It was not the hush of absence, nor the pause between sounds, nor even the waiting stillness before a storm. It was the silence of a world that had turned its face away, of something hidden behind the folds of time, something neither dead nor alive, something merely waiting. Who should not have, the whisper had said, curling around him like ivy around the bones of a long-forgotten tower. Radagast closed his eyes, pressing his palm against the nearest tree, feeling the slow, rhythmic beat of its life humming beneath the bark, a steady, ancient song that had endured for centuries. But even here, in the heart of the living wood, there was no comfort. The trees were afraid. The roots beneath him trembled with a fear so deep that it had sunk beyond words, beyond thought, beyond even the understanding of those who had dwelt here since the earliest days of Middle-earth. This was not a fear of shadow or flame, not the fear of axe or fire or creeping corruption. This was the fear of knowledge, the fear of something that should never have been spoken, the fear of a name that had been whispered into the bones of the world and had refused to fade. Radagast exhaled, his voice low and measured. "Who?" he asked, though the answer was already stirring at the edges of his thoughts, taking shape like the slow gathering of clouds before a storm. Who remembered you? Who sought you out when even the trees had chosen to forget? For a long moment, there was nothing but the deep, shuddering breath of the forest. Then, a whisper, neither loud nor soft, neither near nor far, neither a voice nor a thought, but something in between. A man. Radagast felt his heart tighten. A man. Not an elf, not a creature of shadow or wraith or lingering specter, but a man. One of the younger races, one whose days were measured in the fleeting moments between sunrise and dusk, one whose footsteps upon the earth were shallow, barely leaving a mark upon the long and winding path of time. But men, though mortal, had power, not the power of the Ainur, not the power of the elves who wove their songs into the very fabric of the world, but another kind of power, the power to remember, and in remembering, to shape the world anew. He had seen it before. He had seen how men could bend the world with their thoughts, how their words, though fleeting, could carve themselves into stone and history, leaving scars upon the land that even the longest-lived creatures could not erase. He had seen how they clung to memory, how they wove stories from the bones of the past, how they called forth legends and made them real by the mere act of speaking them. And now, one of them had remembered. Mirgul. The weight of that realization settled deep into his bones, heavy as the roots of the world itself. Radagast turned his gaze toward the darkness between the trees, his voice a murmur, though the presence that surrounded him had no need for sound to understand his thoughts. A man, he echoed, his mind racing through possibilities, through names, through the ever-turning wheel of time. Not an elf, nor a wizard, nor one of the great ones who have walked this land before. a man. What man would know of you? What man would seek you? The voice that answered was neither pleased nor sorrowful, neither cruel nor kind. It simply was, as though the knowledge itself had no feeling, no will, no sense of itself beyond the truth of its own being. Who should not have looked where no eyes were meant to see? Radagast closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of those words press against him, as though the trees themselves had leaned in to whisper their sorrow into his skin. Men have always sought what lies beyond their reach, he said at last, his voice softer now, tinged with something almost like mourning. They chase the unknown as though it is their birthright, as though they must grasp it before time carries them away. But there are things in this world that do not wish to be found, things that should not be named. You were one of them, and now you have been given shape once more. The air trembled, not in rage nor in sorrow, but in something vast and unreadable, something that did not belong to the world of mortals, nor to the world of the living, nor even to the world of the dead. I did not choose to wake. Radagast let out a slow breath. No, he murmured, you did not, but someone has chosen for you. The silence that followed was deep and knowing, stretching out between the branches, curling into the spaces between the leaves, settling into the very roots of the trees. And in that silence, Radagast knew the truth. Whatever man had spoken Mirgul's name, whatever hand had pulled the memory from the earth, it had not been done out of ignorance. It had been done with intent. Someone had searched for Mirgul, and someone had found it. The realization sent a slow, creeping unease through him, deeper than fear, colder than the night wind curling through the trees. He had thought for a moment that he had come here to listen, to understand what had been lost. But now he knew the truth. He was not the first to seek this place, and he would not be the last. Radagast lifted his gaze to the forest, to the towering boughs that had sheltered the world for ages uncounted, to the whispering leaves that now carried a knowledge too great for any one mind to bear. The trees did not answer him, but he could feel their sorrow, their trembling, their quiet, helpless knowledge of what had been set in motion. The past had been stirred, and now the future would follow. Radagast turned, gripping his staff with fingers lined with earth and age, his voice a whisper against the night. I must find him. The forest did not reply, but the path before him began to open. The forest had changed. It was not that the trees had shifted their roots or bent their boughs in some unnatural way, nor that the sky had darkened beyond the branches overhead, nor that the air had thickened into something near tangible, though all these things felt true in the deeper places of the mind. It was a change more subtle, more insidious, as if the very world had inhaled, holding its breath in quiet dread, waiting for the thing that had been whispered into being to step forward into the waking light. Radagast felt it in the way the soil clung to his bare feet, damp and cool, as if the earth itself was reluctant to release its hold upon him, as if the path he now walked was no longer entirely his own. He felt it in the silence, in the places where song should have been, where the nocturnal chorus of insects and night birds should have filled the air with a steady, living hum. He felt it in the trees, their trunks great and ancient, their roots twisting deep into the bones of the world, their limbs reaching upward with a stillness that was not rest, but watchfulness. And beyond all this, beneath the hush of the unseen things that lay coiled within the shadows, he felt Miracle. Not as a presence, not as a being that moved and breathed as creatures of flesh and will do, but as a weight, as a thought given shape by memory, as an echo long buried now stretching its limbs for the first time in an age. It was neither alive nor dead, neither light nor shadow, neither good nor evil. It simply was, and that, more than anything, was what unsettled him the most. Radagast had spent his long years tending to things that belonged to the earth, things that knew their place within the great, intricate web of existence. Even the smallest beetle crawling through the leaves understood its purpose, its place in the turning of the world. But Mirgu had no place. It had not been created. It had not been born. It had simply come to be, and the world had recoiled from it. The trees had buried it. The rivers had refused to carry its name. But now, someone had remembered. Radagast exhaled, running his fingers over the worn, gnarled wood of his staff, feeling the grain beneath his palm, grounding himself against the quiet, creeping unease that curled around his thoughts. I must find him, he murmured again, though the words felt thinner now, smaller against the vastness of what lay before him. The one who spoke your name, the presence, if it could be called that, did not answer. But the forest shifted, not in movement, not in sound, but in something deeper, something ancient and unseen, as though the very trees had reached back into their roots, into the long and winding corridors of memory, searching, remembering, knowing. And then a whisper. He does not know what he has done. Radagast's breath caught, though he had already suspected as much. A man, some wanderer, some scholar, some seeker of knowledge, had looked where none were meant to look, had spoken where silence had been meant to reign, and in doing so, he had woken something that should have remained buried. The wizard closed his eyes, pressing his palm against the rough bark of an ancient oak, feeling its slow and steady life pulse beneath his touch, steady as the tides, as the turning of the stars above. Then tell me, he murmured, voice low, measured, careful. Tell me who he is. The whisper curled around him, weaving through the mist that clung low to the earth, neither hurried nor reluctant, but simply knowing, is called Edrahil. Radagast's brow furrowed. A name, a man's name, not the name of a sorcerer, nor of some scholar bound in the service of hidden powers, nor of some fallen creature who sought dominion over things best left untouched. Just a name, and that, more than anything, unsettled him, because it meant that Edrahil was no different from any other man. He was not a servant of darkness. He was not a wielder of foul magics. He was not one of Sauron's lingering shadows, creeping back into the world in some twisted guise. He was simply a man. A man who had searched where no one should have searched. A man who had remembered what should have remained forgotten. A man who had done what all men, in their endless curiosity, in their relentless need to know, could so easily do. He had called something back into the world without understanding what it was. Radagast's grip on his staff tightened, a slow, measured breath escaping his lips. Where is he now? The air trembled. He does not yet understand what he carries. Radagast's pulse quickened. The realization settled upon him like a stone sinking through deep water, slow and inevitable, dragging with it a weight of knowing that could not be undone. Edrahil was not merely the one who had spoken Murgle's name. He had awakened it. He had become its vassal. The forest seemed to draw inward, the trees closing in around him, the darkness pressing closer, the weight of unseen things coiling through the roots and soil. And in that hush, in that slow and knowing stillness, Radagast understood the final, terrible truth. This was no longer about remembering. This was about stopping what had begun. Radagast inhaled, steadying his breath, feeling the rhythm of the world around him, feeling the heartbeat of the trees, the slow whisper of the wind, the murmur of the unseen presence that had no face, no form, no will beyond the simple, aching need to exist. And then, at last, he turned. The forest did not move, but the path before him had opened. Not in the way of mortal roads, not in the way of marked trails and well-worn footsteps, but in the way that the world itself made way for those who had become part of its turning. Radagast stepped forward. He did not know what he would find. He did not know what Edrahil had become. He only knew this: the past had woken, and the future now stood upon the edge of a blade. And in the hush of the waiting trees, in the hush of something vast and unseen shifting through the very bones of the world, he walked into the darkness.